And now I would like to introduce John Diaconis, who is from the Miller House and the person who I rely on for so many wonderful programs. So welcome, John.
Thank you,
And,
Joan. We have a program tonight that I am really excited about. It's a book that I've read and I've listened to. It's excellent. It's by Mary Calvi, who is the morning anchor of CBS News. She's the weekend anchor of Inside Edition, and I think tonight or this week she's filling in for Deborah Norville on CBS News. And I think she's won some Emmy Awards for her great journalism. And this book is definitely a journalistic piece, because there was a lot of research that was involved, and you'll see that when you read the book. I just want to briefly also mention my fellow board members from the Friends of the Miller House that are here: Lynn Briggs, David Chen, and Libby Del Greco are visiting us virtually tonight, and I hope they will enjoy the show. I'm sure they will also. I now I'm going to turn it over to Mary, if you have some introductory comments that you'd like to make, or you could field my first question, which is what is the book about? Because I know some people may not have read it, and it would be good to have a little bit of background about the story.
Well, John, thank you so much. It's such a thrill to be with you, and I can't thank you enough for inviting me. Just so kind of you and generous of the Chappaqua Library to host this event. I thank you very much for having me. It was really, truly a thrill to be able to find a story about a young George Washington and never before known first love story involving Washington, and a woman from my hometown who was the richest single woman in colonial America. Her family owned 250,000 acres of land all along the Hudson River. So the story is a story of love, yes, but also a story of deception and, in the end, vengeance. And I say this, but I still kind of am surprised that I was able to find something like this, hidden away for centuries. And never would I have ever expected in my life to find a story about George Washington that others had not known.
True. I mean, there's been how many books written about George Washington? Hundreds, probably thousands, many thousands. And when you think all has been written, you found a story that no one else had found. What was it that gave you the idea to try to research this topic, and what type of research did you have to do?
Well, after experiencing this, I realized that history lies hidden in every hometown, just waiting to be discovered. And for me, it was in a beautiful historic manor in Yonkers, where I grew up, and as a little girl went to visit. A beautiful historic home that we had gone on a group visit. And I remember walking through this gorgeous manor and was very curious about the people who had lived there. And one of the women who lived there was a woman named Mary. And maybe because my name is Mary and her name was Mary, it sort of stuck with me. And it was talked about at the time that and George Washington once courted Mary. And so I had known this as a little girl. It was local lore, urban legend. And honestly, it didn't dawn on me to continue researching that until the time that my husband was having an inauguration at Phillips Manor, because Phillips Manor was the original city hall in the 1800s, but in the 1700s was home to the Phillips family. Now, as he was planning his inaugural ceremony, I said to him, it probably would be worthwhile to mention that George Washington supposedly courted the woman who lived here. And he said, yeah, he knew the story too, having grown up in Yonkers. And he said, but, did he? And I
Mhm.
thought, well, that's a good question, and being
Mhm.
a journalist, I thought, well, let me see if I can find out a nugget of truth. So that's what I had expected to find, just like information about a walk in the park between the two of them, or just like an interview, as they would call it, like the date at that time. And instead, it was just like the documents came pouring out of the files and the storage cabinets, and
Mhm.
I could not believe what was being revealed to me. And it was just document after document, and it was putting a massive puzzle together. And truthfully, every piece fit perfectly. And so it just pushed me to continue doing the research. And I continue to question myself, of course, because I thought, well, how is it that nobody else had seen this before? How is it that nobody realized there was this vengeance? How did no one realize there was a conspiracy against George Washington? And so, in his young years, who knew Washington was a romantic? And so, this is when I just completely got caught up in it, and I was just, John, like knee deep in research, and just completely covered in documents. I mean, it was just like piles of paperwork that I was, sifting through, and trying to understand what this story was really revealing.
Mhm. Where did you do most of the research?
Well, I can actually show some of it to you. I have it, so you
Oh,
can take a look at it. But this story wasn't in one place. Like, it wasn't like I could go into a storage unit, oh, and there it was,
mhm.
or in an attic, and oh, there it was. It was really dispersed everywhere. So there were some documents that were at Huntington Library in California. There were others that were Boston Public Library, and thank goodness for the libraries. So
Mhm.
many of the archivists preserved history for many, many years. Library of Congress, of course, was an important spot for me. There were also documents out of Canada, documents out of France, documents out of London that were required in order to be able to bring it all together. And really, truly, now is the best time to be doing historical research, because
Mhm.
the physical archives and the digital archives have collided. So I
Mhm.
can explain to you what I mean. So one of the articles, when I started doing the research, that
Mhm.
came up was one that was written by Woodrow Wilson, and it is from a Harper's from back in the 1800s. So here it is. I had to get the original because there
Mhm.
wasn't any digital, but I was able to kind of find a place where I could find this through just internet searches. So it took me quite some time, but in it is an article written about a young George Washington. And if you can
Mhm.
see the picture there, that is a young George and
Mhm.
Mary Eliza Phillips. And Mary Phillips is the woman who I was mentioning to you, was supposedly courting George Washington in his young years. So while I was able to find that, then I wanted to find the original portrait that was done. It's a painting that's at Boston
Mhm.
Public Library in storage. It
Mhm.
hasn't ever, I don't think, been out of storage, because no one's ever really been
Mhm.
interested in George and Mary. They mostly are thinking about George and Martha.
Mhm.
This was before Martha was Mary. So a lot of the documents you actually have to see for yourself, but
Mhm.
some of them I was able to get a hold of through digital access, through the
Mhm.
archivist being able to send me those images. So I was able to continue doing the research like that.
He looked pretty dapper in that
Did-
outfit that he
Didn't
was
he? Yeah.
wearing. It looked like a red coat. One of the things that I thought was so interesting about the book, and that I learned, was that during this courtship, George Washington was actually fighting for the British and not against the British. Can you talk about that period of his life and how that affected his relationship with Mary Eliza, who was, I understand, not English, not British, but was actually Dutch, which was the nationality that many of the people were originally in New Amsterdam and New York.
So I believe, this is a piece of history in regard to George Washington that we don't hear much about. This
Mhm.
George Washington in his very young years, and it was George Washington trying to become a man of dignity. He didn't have much. He had a small farm, but he didn't have great wealth. He was able to maneuver his way into high society through his half brother, Lawrence, who married wealthy. However, George really didn't have much. And so he found his way up the ladder through the military, and he volunteered himself. And he did things that other people would not do. I mean, he was very courageous in so many of the elements of his fighting, and it was quite incredible, his prowess in the military. And many people have heard of the Braddock expedition, but that's when George sort of became this hero. And journals were written about him, and articles were written about George Washington. So his name was very well known as in the British Army. And so George Washington tried to climb the ladder in the British Army, but was having a lot of trouble, making it to the top, because a lot of the commanders were bringing in their own, from England, and George was from here, so from Virginia. So he sort of didn't quite fit in. However, he kept on trying. And the story goes, that George Washington in his early 20s, after winning accolades in a number of battles, made his way to New York, and that's where he met Mary. The Smithsonian Channel recently did a documentary based on this research, and I have a clip of it. So if you'd like to see it, I could bring that up.
Would love to see it.
Quite exciting to be able to be part of this, because we filmed it at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And so I'll play a clip of it for everybody right now.
It may be then that Washington is welcomed into his fellow Virginians' New York home and meets Robinson's sister-in-law, Mary.
Mary was the it girl of her time. I could see him being interested in a woman who owned 50,000 acres of land all along the Hudson River. Mary, we all want to know.
So it was quite exciting to have that documentary on Smithsonian Channel. It is now, if anybody's interested in seeing it on demand. It's called George Washington's Secret Love. And truly, it has been kept a secret for centuries. When the book was published, I had the opportunity to go on CBS Sunday Morning, and I was interviewed. And this was a question that a lot of people asked me. So I wanted to play this for you so you can see it for yourself and tell me what you think.
Was George Washington sexy?
George Washington was a stud back in the 1700s. Are you kidding? Women wanted a touch of him, is what was said.
Now, surprisingly, I don't know if you can, sorry about that. Were you able to see that?
We heard it.
Oh,
I've seen it already. It's very good.
My apologies. But George Washington truly was a romantic, in his young years, and many people didn't know that about him. So to be able to find a love poem written by George Washington, a love letter written by George Washington, and to find out that he danced the night away with different women. In fact, he didn't sit down until every woman had a chance to dance with him. So that was really revealing for me.
Yeah, great stuff. I was interested, and I think people that are listening would also be interested in the fact that his love was thwarted, and he did not actually end up with the woman that he deeply loved. And some people might say that the British had something to do with that. They didn't maybe like the idea of a colonist marrying into such a well-off family, politically and socially and economically. Do you think that George was affected in any way by the split up, and did he harbor? Did the British do anything to upset the romance? And did George think that they did, and have some adverse reaction to that?
John, absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that there was a conspiracy against George Washington. They wanted one of their own to move in on the richest single woman in colonial America. I mean, she owned 50,000 acres of land. Her family owned just miles and miles of property. Of course, they would want one of their own. They were stationed in New York. They pushed him down, had him stationed in a undone fort down in Virginia. And really, I believe, made sure he wasn't going to get a chance to be with this girl. And so to go back, the thing that was really important to me is the exactness of the story and the very specific details. So, people would ask, how would you find, to me, I wanted to know on that specific day in 1758, where was George Washington? Now, most people would think, oh, you can never find that, but 100% you can. You can find out exactly where George Washington was on January 2nd of 1758 by looking at his journals, by looking at the newspaper articles. I mean, there is a way. And so I wanted to show you something, if I could try to share this with you, because this was really important to the story and to the research. If you could see it now, this is a document that was found at a library in California, and it lists all of the men who are interested in courting Mary Phillips. This is like her list of suitors. And this list was so eye-opening to me. In fact, in the book, I was able to get it for the end papers. So the copyright for it. The reason why it was important is because the men on this list were very familiar to me. One of them was in charge of George Washington's finances in the British Army. Another was in charge of his location. I mean, they had him surrounded. I mean, they made sure that he wasn't going to get his hands on Mary Eliza Phillips. He tried, though, and many times, and that's where the novel, brings up the times that they did have together. There's really interesting books that were written about George Washington. You mentioned, thousands of them, but a number of them do mention Mary Eliza Phillips, surprisingly. This one by Henry Cabot Lodge, this is an original, and talks about how George Washington fell in love with Mary in short order. And we could go through historian after historian, especially at the time, in the 1800s. They talk a lot about Mary Phillips. Now, as we get into more present day biographers, Mary is no longer mentioned. I don't know why she fell out of favor, but I do know that she's mentioned quite a bit. Now, when we talk about that vengeful act, this is something that I thought was really fascinating. And if anybody is interested, I can certainly get a copy of this to you. This is an article that was written in the colonial papers, and it attacks George Washington and his credibility. I mean, it talks about him being a womanizer, a gambler, a drunk. I mean, it compares him to the worst military rulers that have ever been around in the world. This article, I think, is so important to our history. And it shows how the Brits at the time, this is 20 years before tea was tossed into Boston Harbor, the Brits really went after George Washington. Of course, during the research and as part of the novel, you'll learn who I believe wrote this article and why they wrote the article and the article itself. However, I think that for some reason, historians have not taken this article and really looked at it very carefully. And I feel like it's so important to the research of George Washington, because after this article was written, I mean, you see a change in George Washington in his writings. I mean, you could look at every letter that George has written. So many of them, they are transcribed. So you can take a look and you could see a distinct difference between George Washington's loyalties to the British Army before Mary Eliza Phillips and then after Mary Eliza Phillips. I see in his writings that resentment, that bitterness stays with him. I mean, there is, they even try to reach out to George Washington during this time before 1775. And, he has no use really for the British commanders. And I think that stayed with him. And when the American Revolution is about to begin and they're looking for a person to lead, and while George Washington sort of stepped back and said, I don't want to be a part of it, he went in there full force because he knew he had already been dealt with this this attack really on him, and really not only did they attack him, but in the end, they stole his girl away. And so I think he had a real reason to want independence. not just
Mhm.
for the country, but really, for himself and personal
Mhm.
rights. And I believe they took that away from him.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention just in regard to Mary Eliza Phillips, what was really important for me when I was doing this research. I mean, I really was very, very upset about what happened to her. And not that I want to, be a spoiler, certainly if people are interested in reading the novel. But Mary Eliza Phillips is one of three women that was named traitor in the American Revolution. Three women.
Mhm.
So, of
Mhm.
course, I wanted to know, well, what did she do, that was treasonous? I mean, of course, she must have done something. And so in the end, I realized, John, that the three women that are named traitors in the American Revolution are the only three women who own real property in the
Mhm.
colony of New York.
Mhm.
And the way they were named traitors was through this law that was the harshest law ever passed, and before or after. And she, her sister, and a minister's wife were the only three women affected. Not only did they name them traitors, it was much worse than that. They took everything from them. They took all of their property, they took all of their possessions. And on top of that, they were condemned to death. And so I was quite stunned to realize that this was a land grab and
Mhm.
that these women did not deserve this. And so now I was completely fascinated, and I had no choice but to get into the research to understand and just watch this unravel before my
Mhm.
eyes. So here I was, with a house full of documents,
Mhm.
and having my husband come over and look through it with me, and my kids and everybody I could think of, and every person who was interested in history that I knew, to take a look and say, what is this saying? And it was quite clear. And the story, I believe, is love, deception, vengeance, and a woman who was left without a voice. And so
Mhm.
I felt that it was really essential for me to tell her story. I had no intention of writing a book. My
Mhm.
plan was to give all of this documentation to a George Washington historian and say, here you go. I mean, this is about
Mhm.
a woman in my hometown, and I think this story needs to be told. And when I did that, I did it with someone who I knew who was in the publishing world, believing that they could, lead me to a wonderful Washington historian. And instead, he led me right into the editor's room and said, sit and talk with the editors, because I think, this is a story that you should write. And this is a novel that needs to get out there. And so
Mhm.
um, it was a very difficult decision, being that I had a full-time job, and I had three kids, and my husband's the mayor. So there was a lot going on in our world. However, I just ended up spending the next couple of years just with every spare moment I had to be able to find this woman's story, to find the Washington story,
Mhm.
and be able to tell it. And so it was quite an honor, really a
Mhm.
true honor, to be able to bring her to life and
Mhm.
tell a story of Washington, who I think that we see him, in marble, and you see him on the dollar bill, but like, who is he?
Mhm.
And when you go back to him as a young man and you look at the authenticity of First Love, you see a Washington that I think is someone different than we have
Mhm.
taught in our school.
Mhm. It's so true. We all learned, or at least I learned, that Washington supported the revolution for economic reasons, for taxation and things like that. But it very well could have been the personal loss that he experienced, and the way the British treated him during this important relationship and the love affair that he had. So it could have been a combination
Yeah,
of those two things.
I think that his rights really were taken away from
Yeah.
him. I mean, he wasn't allowed to do what he believed he should have been able to do. So I think, yes, of course, economics played a role. Of course, yes. But I think this sort of like stuck with him for a long, long time. And there's a love letter that I wanted to show everyone that I thought might be interesting. And it's in Washington's writing. And I could certainly get you a link if anybody's interested to this love letter that is at the library, that is at
Oh,
Harvard University's
well,
library.
great penmanship.
Can you see it?
Is that his penmanship? That's George's.
Yes, it is.
writing?
Yes, it is. And I'm
Nice
just
work.
putting my glasses on. And on the end of the first line, you can see, I feel the force of her amiable beauties and the recollection of 1,000 tender passages that I could wish to obliterate till I am with her. The love letter was written to a woman named Sally Fairfax, and it's long believed that Washington had a love interest named Sally Fairfax. However, in the book, you'll see that I believe Washington was writing that letter to Sally Fairfax, but I believe he was writing it about Mary, Eliza Phillips. But his writing is quite beautiful, and he is very romantic. And so that was a lot of fun to be able to explore Washington in that way.
We've got some interesting questions here on the chat board, and one is by Madam President Ronnie Diamondstein. And she asks, why did you choose to write fiction and not nonfiction? I think you partially talked about that, but can you get into a little more detail about what made you make that decision?
Absolutely. Of course, my first idea was to be able to tell this story as a nonfiction book. However, women's voices were not preserved. And so her letters did not exist and information about her did not exist. So if I were to do the story like that, I would be telling a story that really was without her. And so I felt it very important to be able to bring her voice into it. And that's why I ended up doing it as a novel. It also gave me an opportunity to really explore Yonkers and Westchester, because this is my hometown. And so I was able to find out about this world in the 1700s. I really had no idea that it was so dynamic at the time with what was happening. I guess I hadn't really thought about it beforehand. So I used cookbooks from the 1700s to bring in recipes and foods that were made at that time. I actually got a teacup from the time, and I used that. I drank tea out of this while I was writing the book, just to sort of get into that frame of mind, and also listen to classical music of that time. So by writing it as a novel, I was able to sort of bring all of that to life, the music, foods, and that was very enjoyable to be able to do it that way.
In terms of your writing process, besides sipping tea and listening to classical music of the time, did you write at any particular time of the day? Did you have a strict routine, or did you just try to get the writing in whenever you could?
Yeah, so my kids were quite young at the time. And so there was a lot of, driving here, driving there, taking care of dinner, all of that. So, I would have like a meatloaf in the oven, and I'd get right to writing, and I would wake up early, very early on the weekends, and write as many hours as I possibly could. It was really an everyday process, and it was every free moment that I had that I would be either doing research or doing the writing. And it really, I can't explain really exactly what it was like, but I was just driven to get this story out there. It was just, I just had to have it. I just had to tell it. And every time I would find a new document, I was always stunned that there was another document. And so I knew that, that had to get in there. And but really, it was just for years. I just was spending every possible moment I had in being able to find out the story. Being that I'm a journalist, I think that there's, this thing in instinctively that, you want to find out the truth. And so you just just keep going until you
Mhm.
feel like you've actually found it. I think still there is much that needs to be told. I have since had some wonderful conversations with her family
Mhm.
in England,
Mhm.
our direct descendants. And so we talk a lot about what might still be missing and
Mhm.
what other pieces that would be quite fascinating to be able to find out. So
It's interesting that she went back to England and not the Netherlands, right? If she was Dutch, but we've got two more really good questions. One is by our a board member of the Friends of the Miller House, um, Libby Del Greco, who is the corporate secretary, and she asks that who named the women traitors? Was it the colonists or the Tories?
so at the time, you know, we were transitioning between British and our government, and a small group of legislators, one of them being James Jay. You will probably recognize the last name,
Another
Jay.
Westchester name.
That's correct. John Jay being his brother.
Yeah.
James Jay became a legislator, and the first thing he did was draft a law, an act of attainder. And in this law, I actually have a copy of it if anybody would like to see it. It names traitors to
Mm.
the to their side, and it not only names them traitors, but this law also convicts them. So they were basically judge, jury, and executioner in this meeting room, a private meeting room, and the law passed quite quickly and by a small group of people. There were a number opposed, and those opposed were vehemently opposed, saying there is no proof that these people are traitors. However, I believe James Jay and a number of other legislators were interested in getting the land away from these people. There were a number of reasons for that, and I go into it in the book. But I believe it was a matter of inheritance, that I believe James Jay thought he should have gotten the inheritance that instead the Phillips family got. And so it's a long and dramatic story. But I believe this was a very vengeful act on his part. And these people were named traitors, and they were left with nothing. There's talk that Mary was a loyalist. I've gone through every document that I could find, and I cannot find any proof of that. In fact, her properties and the Phillips properties were called neutral ground by one of Washington's own officers. And there was even a letter sent to the Brits saying, you know, the Phillips properties are neutral ground, and please, Brits, do not pillage or rummage or fire upon these properties. They are neutral. Well, the Brits' letter in return was quite interesting when I found it, which was, we're in the middle of war. You know, you can't be asking this. The interesting part about it is that the Phillips properties did survive the American Revolution, where many of the properties did not survive. And so I believe that was due to Washington's influence. Washington used the Phillips properties, and you would know this because you're at the Miller House, but he stayed at so many places along the Westchester route during the Revolution, and many
Mhm.
Phillips properties. So
Right.
there is a question about Mary's brother's loyalty and whether he was a loyalist. So I went in through to all of this to be able to, you know, make these determinations. It was quite
Yeah,
exciting.
great stuff. So fake news and political intrigue is not new. It occurred back at inception. Just a little plug for the Miller House. That's one of the places that George Washington stayed during the Revolution in October of 1776. He slept there and used that as his headquarters for part of the Battle of White Plains. So everyone is invited to the house. Mary, you're invited. Everyone is invited. Joan, if you haven't seen it, everyone that's attending virtually tonight, the house is in North White Plains and will be open to the public probably in a month or so. And it's been refinished, and we have County Executive George Latimer to thank for that. He made a pledge that he would have the house renovated, and he followed through on that pledge. The the next question is something that we spoke about briefly before, and it's by Mary Horowitz, and she asks, when did George meet Martha? That's a great question. And how was their relationship in comparison to George's relationship with Mary Eliza? Take it away.
Well, that's a wonderful question, and one that I was really interested in, of course. George met Martha a few months after Mary married another man, and I don't want to give all the details away. Martha at the time was a widow of about 8 months. She owned a plantation in the South, and she had 2 children. George met Martha briefly, but was interested and returned. They were engaged and married about a year later. The one thing that I think is quite telling, and it's right here in that love letter that I had showed you earlier. I'll just bring up the screen and see if you can see it really quickly. But in this love letter, George Washington is speaking of love. However, he mentions Martha in it. And it's clear that when he's talking about love, he is not talking about Martha. So in the second paragraph, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but he refers to her as Mrs. Custis in the love letter. If anybody's interested in seeing this further, I can certainly get it to you. But the question about George and Martha, I took to a Martha historian because I really wanted to know their point of view. And the number of folks that I talked to said, George and Martha had a wonderful marriage and they had a wonderful companionship. But when it came to a very romantic relationship, it is assumed that there wasn't a great, wonderful romance, but had a wonderful relationship in being able to raise the children that were hers. He did not have any children with Martha. And so he never danced with Martha, even though he was a great dancer. And she did not attend his inauguration as president. So there are some questions about things like that. And it's hard to tell the real details because their letters, Martha burned the letter to George Washington after he passed. Now, that was common. So, I mean, I don't want to look in, read into that so much, but that's the problem, that we don't have a lot of letters to Martha.
Speaking of letters, I don't think I'm giving up much of a big part of the book. I'll try to be a little bit ambiguous about this, but Mary Eliza did end up marrying someone from the British Army. And I think that it would be fair to say she did it reluctantly. And one of the reasons was that she hadn't heard from George for a couple of years. And you suggested in the book that George, in fact, did write letters to Mary Eliza, but for some reason, they didn't get to Mary Eliza, and that could have been part of the British cabal and trying to keep them separate. Could you talk about that? I'd love to hear the facts about that.
Yeah, sure. So the fascinating thing about that separation of time is George has a confidant in New York who is writing him letters about Mary and explaining that, she's still here, she's still waiting for you. And the Joseph Chu letters are wonderful to be able to read. If anybody's interested, I could share those with you. So there's clear evidence that Washington is asking about Mary and wondering about her, and I believe writing letters to her. The family, the Phillips family, has said that it is family history that the letters existed, and that they unfortunately burned when one of the homes burned down years and years ago. However, it is exciting to be able to consider what may have been. And so that's one of the things that I tried to research as much as possible to understand what might have been and exactly happened. And I don't want to give it away, but Mary was a young woman when she was married. And I believe that is because she was waiting for George to return for her. There is this moment in the winter of 1757 that it seems clear to me that Washington did come to see Mary. And there is a really important moment together where I think, things could have been very different. And one of the questions in the documentary was, well, what if George Washington had married Mary Eliza Phillips? What could have happened? And we explore that. And it's a question that I think is a fascinating one, because Mary being, so wealthy, owning so much property, would George have stayed as a British officer? I mean, it's just quite it leaves you questioning whether his feelings towards the Brits may have been very different, and whether that resentment, if it didn't exist, what could have been, and how would the revolution, would it have changed, and would he have been the general? So it's quite the mystery, really, and something fun to think about.
A lot of uncertainty. There's another question here that is a very good one, and it's by Maria Monterulli, and she says that your enthusiasm and passion is inspiring, and the $64,000 question that hopefully you will answer in some way, not to give up any secrets, is what is your next novel? If you can talk about that. And
well, let me explain. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate the kind words. It's very, very, very nice. And if anybody is interested in writing or researching, please let me know, because I love being able to share my experience. And I think there's so many wonderful opportunities to write and research. So please, if anybody's interested, just let me know. So when I was on the book tour for Dear George, Dear Mary, I was able to go to such wonderful places. I was up at Harvard. I was at the 92nd Street Y. I mean, it was just super exciting. I went to beautiful historic homes. I was at the Miller House. It was a beautiful place. I mean, to step back in time and just to see all the detail. I just loved it. I just loved walking just on the wood, to kind of experience what they would have experienced at that time. So it's a beautiful place, just a hidden gem, and a place to treasure, certainly. And as I was doing the book tour, one of the independent bookstore owners came to me and said, this reminds me of another story. And I said, really? And he said, well, it reminds me of Abraham Lincoln and his first love, Anne. And I said, what a wonderful story. I would love to read that book. And he said, well, nobody's ever written the book. And I said, what? I said, really? And so I started doing the research of Abraham Lincoln and Anne, which is could very well be a wonderful story, but it will take quite a bit of work because the documents aren't easily accessible. So this is the time I'm going to be in storage units, like just digging through. However, the publisher, St. Martin's Press, came to me after the Dear George, Dear Mary was published and said, we're really interested in talking to you about your second novel. And so, of course, this Abe and Anne story was kind of swirling about in my head. And a very good friend of mine, and when you're writing a book, it's always good to have dear friends next to you, trying to help you through, giving you, like, reading the kissy parts and telling you if it works or not. And so one of my good friends said to me, Mary, you should really consider researching other presidents and their first loves. I mean, maybe there's another story that deserves to be told. Boy, John, I found one that I am just so thrilled by. And I found the love letters between the two of them, and they've never been published. And it's a stunning story that I hope I can tell the way it should be told, because this woman's voice deserves to be heard. So I'm in the middle of that. I did get signed a book deal with St. Martin's Press. And the manuscript will be handed in the beginning of next year. Thankfully, they give you a year together. And it will likely be published the following President's Day. So it won't be till 2023. But I'm very excited about it. And I've been just sort of all in with the research. I don't know. I wasn't sure I was going to do another, write another novel. But after seeing these love letters, I said, they have to be, they have to be in a book. I mean, how is it that they haven't been in all these years? So we go into the 1800s for this. So it's 100 years. It's another century, and a lot of fun to be able to do the research for that.
Right.
I'm sorry,
Look-
I want to tell everybody it,
I'm
but they don't
looking
let me
forward-
say it yet. So
Looking forward to that. Although I can tell if it's about a president, you're getting closer to the present day. I can tell that's the case. But we look forward to that, and hopefully you'll come back to the Chappaqua Library and speak about the book when it's published, and also talk about the Smithsonian Documentary, which I saw, and I think people would love to see that also. Could you just describe what the documentary is about, and how it can be seen? If it can be seen on Smithsonian, I'm not sure if it can be.
Oh yeah, so it's airing currently, called George Washington's Secret Love, and it's part of their America's Hidden Stories series.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
you go on to Smithsonian Channel. I believe you can find it in, as a
Mhm.
you can I'm sorry, on demand. Also, there is but it's also airing. Like if you look at the guide, I believe it's still airing. I could probably find that out exactly when it's going to air in the guide, or at least I could provide it to anybody who's interested. And so the global release, so that it'll be released, on Amazon Video and Hulu and everything.
Mhm.
Watch this, I
Mhm.
believe, in the next month. So that's exciting.
Mhm. Mhm. Great. Is the house that you talked about where the inauguration was, is that in downtown Yonkers? Was that the Phillips house? Phillips, was that part of the family's house?
Yeah.
Was
So yes, the Phillips Manor home is in downtown Yonkers, and
okay.
you can take a look at it. It's a lovely place. It's a historic home, and that's a gorgeous spot. They
Mhm.
also owned a home, and actually, I have a gorgeous painting of it. It's right here, if you could see it. This is
Mhm.
the Morris Jumel Mansion, and this is a scene, and Mary is right here in
Mhm. Mhm.
yellow and orange. Morris Jumel Mansion is a lovely mansion in Harlem, and basically Mary owned pretty much Harlem, and the estate still stands. And
Mhm.
it was on the second highest hill in Manhattan, so you'd be able to see the British coming from there.
Mhm.
And that is where the Battle of Harlem Heights took place. And if anybody's interested in going to see it, there might be another reason, because Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote parts of Hamilton while
Oh,
in
interesting.
that
Yeah.
home. Aaron Burr owned the home after the
Yeah.
Phillipses. And so there's quite a bit of history. And
Mm.
that they provided me with letters from back then that were essential in the research of Mary Phillips. So that
Yeah.
was very helpful.
Speaking of which, I think yesterday was the anniversary of Hamilton's death in Weehawken
Really?
at the
Wow.
hands of that
Oh
brute,
my goodness.
Aaron Burr. The if the Phillipses were Dutch and they were able to maintain the house after the British took over from the Dutch in New York City, they must have been pretty nimble in terms of their political affiliations, I think, because I do remember the one time I visited the house, the tour person said, look around the room. They're all portraits of British people. But the house, for the most part, had been owned, and the paintings were of Dutch people. So I just thought it was just so interesting the way that the New York was really controlled, or influenced by the Dutch, more so than the British, and certainly more so, and in a different way than New England was influenced by the Puritans. I guess that's why New York is such debauchery and everything, maybe. But did you learn a lot about or anything special about the Dutch and their stay here in New York City and the Hudson Valley?
So what I looked up specifically is what were the leanings of the Phillips family, of course.
Uh-huh.
And Mary's brother Frederick was, I guess, head of household, and so he was in charge of Phillips Manor, and he was,
Mhm.
you know, a partier. I mean, he was really just interested in socializing and gatherings, and he would invite everybody to that home, and so many people would stop at Phillips Manor because it was really the only place that you could have a great night's sleep before you're going up to Albany. And a number of meetings were held in
Mhm.
Albany. So
Mhm.
if you're leaving Manhattan, even if you're coming through Jersey, the Phillips Manor was really the social gathering place of the time. And he had these very grand feasts for people, and he was very inviting on both sides. I mean, he had everybody stay at his home, and he did not appear at all to take sides. He is there's one thing that's very interesting, and I wanted to mention it, John, and if anybody's interested, please, I have the documentation if you will like to see it. But there was something called the Declaration of Dependence that was signed before the American
Mhm.
Revolution, basically declaring your allegiance to the crown rather than
Mhm.
the Declaration of Independence. And a number of people signed this, and I went to see this. It's at the New York Historical Society. It was quite grand, and these just
Mhm.
large linen papers, poster size, of just signatures and signatures. And there, right in the middle of it, is Frederick Phillips. That's Mary's brother, signing the
Mhm.
Declaration of Dependence. Oh, and so I thought, well, there it is. He is a loyalist, until I find out that that's not actually his signature. It was forged right
Oh.
in the center of the Declaration of Dependence is Frederick Phillips's forged signature, which opens up so many questions as to what exactly happened here, and whether somebody signed on purpose to make it appear that
Hmm.
he had
Oh.
loyal leanings. But what I could tell is that he was quite the host, and entertained people on both sides. I really truly think he was just interested in keeping things, status quo,
Yeah.
because things were going very well for the Phillips family. They owned massive property, and they had mills,
Mhm.
and they were tent
Mhm.
farmers, and actually the biggest money, where they made the most money, was a bridge. It was a tolled bridge in between the island of Manhattan and parts north, and people would have to pay a toll, not just for people to cross, but for, if you wanted to cross your cow,
Right.
you'd have to pay money
Wow.
for that. So they were doing quite well at the time.
Yeah, I guess the British were encamped in New York City for most of the revolution, and there was a lot of support for the British in New York, and I guess that explains it. People were happy with the status quo, and they didn't want things changed. I don't see any more questions, but if anyone has any, now is the time to chime up. Um,
Well, I can
I-
mention that
yeah.
if I there's a lovely bookstore, Walmrath Bookshop in Bronxville, that has been wonderful. That if anybody's interested in a signed copy, like if you need it personalized, you can get in touch with Morin, and we work things beautifully that I can
Okay.
sign it for you, because I normally in person I would have a chance to sign a book for whoever would like that. And I apologize that we can't do that in this way, but Walmrath Bookshop in Bronxville is
Yeah.
the place to call. We're always in communication if anybody
Okay.
would
What
like that.
what was that again? The name of the
The
store in
bookshop
Bronxville?
in Bronxville is called Womrath. It's WOMRATH.
Okay. Okay. I see
Just
Joan. Do
wanted-
we have time for one more question? I see it here. Oh, it's
I
not a
just wanted-
question.
We'll have it on the scroll to be sure that everybody gets the address. If you
Okay.
would mail it to me. Fine.
This is not a question, but it's another compliment. You are amazing, and this is riveting history. Thank you, and looking forward to the next one. So
Thank you so much.
very
It's
nice comments.
really so wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you for the questions, and always great to talk about history, especially from our hometown. So
And especially at the Chapel Library too. Appreciate very much you spending the night with us. It was very interesting. I enjoyed it very much. I think everyone else did also.
Yes, I think they did. I can't thank you enough. And if anybody hasn't read the book, your presentations and your questions certainly whet anybody's appetite for really what happened.
Mhm.
So much we don't know, and so many blanks still to be, filled in. but just listening to all the way life progressed and all the political dealings is not much different from what's happening
Right,
here in the United
exactly.
States right now.
Mhm.
So it's like history keeps repeating itself no matter what. So my God, Mary, you did a fabulous job. And again, the compliments are coming in. Thank you so much for your time, your effort, not only in preparing and making this book, but for coming and sharing it with all of us.
Mhm.
Great audience, and this was a wonderful presentation. Thank
Much
you,
appreciated. And thank you, Joan, for
John. Yeah, John,
being the
thank you
host.
for everything.
Thank you. Thank you,
Always
Mary.
been a pleasure to deal with, and thank you. So again, thank you all. Have a pleasant evening and stay safe. Bye, everyone.